Everyone, and welcome to the Brown Bag Research Conversation Series. Today, we're going to be speaking with Dr. Robin Goldstein. And I just wanted to welcome everyone and tell you a little bit about Robin. Well, first of all, I'm Seth. I'm from the Berkeley Cannabis Research Center. I'm a graduate student researcher. And our speaker, Dr. Robin Goldstein, is from UC Davis. Dr. Goldstein is the director of the Cannabis Economics Group and an economist in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at UC Davis, where he studies both legal and illegal cannabis markets, with particular focus on regulatory effects and retail prices. He's the co-author of Can Legal Weed Win? The Blunt Realities of Cannabis Economics, published by the UC Press, and has been advising the California's Department of Cannabis Control on economic impacts of cannabis regulation for the past 6 years. Dr. Goldstein holds degrees from Harvard, Yale Law School, and a PhD in economics from the University of Bordeaux. His current research is funded by the Department of Cannabis Control, which examines market dynamics and regulatory impacts across California's cannabis landscape. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Goldstein. Hi, Robin.
Hi, Seth. Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Let's just jump right into it. Oh, actually, let's go through our agenda. Thanks, Peng. So we're going to talk for about 30 minutes. We'll do a 20-minute Q&A. And at the end, we'll let everybody know about some upcoming events that the CRC has in store for us. Some issues with Zoom. Please send us a message. We'll be reviewing the chat as questions come in. These basic Zoom functions, let us know in the chat if you have any problems with your Zoom. All right, great. So let's get started. All right, so Robin, your book, Can Legal Weed Win, was written during the early implementation of the MCRSA, of the early medical cannabis law changes. How have your views on California's cannabis market evolved since its publication, particularly regarding the viability of the legal market?
Well, I would say, first of all, a lot of what we talked about in the book, the book asked the question, can legal weed win? So we didn't make exact predictions. We talked about different directions that the industry could go to based on different regulatory outcomes in part and market phenomena. And basically, I'd say that, one of the biggest things that changed in the last 2 years has been very rapidly falling prices. Our book came out in 2022, and we kind of warned about falling prices and talked about how over time, if prices fall fast enough, even if the quantity of weed consumed or of weed sold at retail is increasing, if the prices were falling far enough, you'd see a decreasing overall market size. And so one of the things we said back then, I think is definitely kind of borne out, is that market size, the total market size as measured by total retail sales, total sales at stores has stagnated or even decreased, and people sometimes look at that and see that as a sign that the legal weed industry is failing or that it's going nowhere, it's stagnating. But in fact, when you have two counteracting phenomena, falling prices and rising quantity, the total market size could go down, and you still have an increased share of the legal market versus illegal. So, but I would say prices fell even faster and maybe a steeper. The fall was steeper than I expected, than any of us expected. It happened very over 2022 and 23. I think that price of an eighth at a dispensary went, on the lower end, went from like $20 to close to $10, and it was just very, very steep. And so some of the things that we thought were going to happen in the long run started happening faster than we expected.
Is that analogous with outside dispensary sales? You talk about the price of an eighth within a dispensary, but some data suggests that maybe less than a third of retail sales are currently in the legal, market, in the tax segment. What are the primary factors that have prevented more market participants from entering the licensed system, would you say?
Yeah, well, a lot of factors. The lower the license price get, the more competitive it gets with the illegal market. So you do have more competitiveness. We don't think it's quite a third anymore. Maybe it's 40 or 50% that's in the legal market. Illegal prices have also fallen though. So the the many factors keeping a lot of folks out of the legal market include access to capital, barriers, licensing, taxation is high. But I think people talk a lot about taxation, but they lifted the cultivation tax. That's another thing that kind of happened since the publication of the book. They lifted the cultivation tax. So it's no longer the case that taxes are the big, if it ever was the case that taxes were really the biggest factor that was making it too expensive or difficult to be legal. That may never have been the case. It's certainly not the case now. It's really the cost of regulations and the regulatory barriers. So the local control, obviously, the inability to uh, open any legal cannabis business in large parts of California. That's a huge one. Of course, the need to have to go through a long process that involves having to have legal advisors and consultants and just dealing with reams and reams of paperwork and bureaucracy that a lot of people coming from the legacy industry, people who are growing cannabis, um, especially in Humboldt County and places like that, they don't have much experience, if any, running any kind of legal business. So uh, it's an uphill battle for those folks to figure out everything they need to do to be legal on the local level, on the county level, state level. And on top of that, the regulatory costs are higher than in almost any other industry. So those two factors put together, the barriers plus the unique regulatory costs for cannabis.
Talk about local control. Like, how would you say local control has worked in California, and how could jurisdictions or states that are thinking of, legalizing recreational cannabis, what lessons could be learned from the California market as far as local control?
Don't do it. I mean, it surprised everyone. I mean, I think we were surprised along with everyone else of how many jurisdictions opted out. When Prop 64 was first proposed and local control was in there, people were talking about it, but it wasn't like people were like, "This is what's going to bring down the bill." It wasn't. People didn't, I think, realize or predict how many local jurisdictions would use that as an opportunity to actually prohibit cannabis completely. I mean, so you went from I mean, it's really amazing what happened. If you look at the 2016 or 17 California market, you had maybe 4,000 retailers all over the state. They were legal in the sense of being legal medical operators, but they weren't subject to much regulation and they were and or any special cannabis taxation, and they were everywhere, and they were operating essentially legally, and they weren't being, there was no enforcement against them for uh, um, anything other than breaking ordinary laws. So you went from a very robust competitive market there where the quality was high, the competition was high, and there was a place in every town to a market where most of it was illegal, and only 10% of the legally operating medical dispensaries that were around before 2018, before Prop 64 took effect, only 10% of them went on in business. And so it was essentially a previously legal industry that was almost entirely put out of business, replaced by it wasn't a transition of a of a sort of illegal or gray market to a legal market. It was a total replacement of one legal market with a different legal market. And it was not the same players, it was not the same companies and providers and growers. It was largely new folks that came in, and most of the people who had been previously legal under the medical system just either went out of business or continued operating or turned into illegal operators by not getting licenses and continuing to operate, maybe exporting or selling on the unlicensed market.
Of these barriers that you've talked about, compliance, normal standard business compliance costs, and then cannabis specific costs and taxes, and then of course the nature of local control and the kind of Byzantine framework that people have to navigate through. Which of these are the biggest factor do you see, or the most significant obstacle to market transition? And do you think that's changed since 64 has passed?
Between local control, what were the other options?
Standard business costs, and then or
Uh-huh.
cannabis specific costs.
Ah, I would say probably cannabis specific costs in the sense of all the costs of complying with the safety and security regulations. That's probably the biggest one of all. Track and trace, having to uh, spend a lot of money on employees to deal with the metric system and entering all the data there, um, having to comply with all these security testing. So if you add up all of the cannabis specific regulatory costs, including testing, safety, security, um, uh, environmental, cannabis specific environmental stuff, the not just the testing, but the need to comply with the no pesticides. That's a big one. No contaminants and all these things that are tested for. So it's not just the cost of testing, but also the cost of failing and the cost of running a farm that's going to be compliant in a way that they won't fail. Um, I would say it's hard to compare. I mean, I don't want to. It's different for every business, so I don't want to make a blanket statement. You know, some businesses are small businesses, I think, are uniquely impacted by these costs of getting legal, period, or previous legacy operators. That was the biggest one for them. For folks who'd had already a kind of large developed maybe chain of medical marijuana businesses, they might have been more used to dealing with kind of ordinary business practices, and for them it might have been the regulatory cost. But I think if you had to make one guess for the whole industry, it would be the cannabis regulations. Yeah.
I see. Um, Pivot slightly, but kind of in the same vein, taxes and taxation in California. It seems like maybe the California's aim to, get a lot of tax revenue sort of worked against people transitioning to the legal market in some ways. What's your assessment of California's current tax structure in regards to its impact on market dynamics and people becoming, legal operators?
Um, it's still high. I mean, even after removing the cultivation tax, the excise tax is still a major factor, and then the fact that they allow local taxes on top of that. And so it varies by jurisdiction. If in local cities or counties where they impose another 5 or 10% on top of the 15% excise, uh, that's that's quite high. So it's the if you wanted to optimize the legal share of the market, you'd have no special cannabis tax. You don't have any special tax on apples. You wouldn't have any special tax on this type of product. You just have ordinary taxes.
Yeah.
The uh, I don't think that the goal of policymakers or the framers of Prop 64 or anyone else was to maximize the amount of taxes collected by California. I think the intent was to maximize the legal market and public safety and get this move this market from the illegal side to the legal side um, as quickly and as effectively as possible. I think that the tax rates were chosen at a level that was high it was too high to enable that to happen easily. But so were the regulatory levers and many other costs. Um, but when the state looks at the choices of, let's say, lowering or raising taxes in the future, it's always having to be in the context of there's a balancing test, there's a choice. Every time you raise taxes, you're going to move some more share from the legal market to the illegal market. You're going to increase uh, tax collections per dollar collected, by the businesses by a little bit, but then you have less businesses, so you don't know if there's called the Laffer curve in economics. You don't know if at some point um, by raising taxes you're actually going to lower total state tax collections. That's not possible. But probably you're not at that point. Probably by raising taxes a little bit, you do collect slightly more taxes, but it's at the cost of having a big transfer from the legal to the illegal market, which is, I think, a lot. The more overarching policy goal is we want to keep shares in legal as much as possible.
In regards to legal, illegal market, your research also shows a significant price difference between licensed and unlicensed markets. Do you think that's an ongoing thing? That's an ongoing trend? And why is that the case?
Oh, it's definitely an ongoing trend, although in California, the difference is shrinking as the legal price plummets. I mean, so now that you're seeing um, a lot of, you know, now that the sort of going price per pound wholesale is, $300 or $400, there, there's you're seeing a lot of eighths for $10 and ounces for $50, 50 to $75. You're even seeing ounces. So that's much more competitive than it was in 2018 or 2020, even with the illegal market. There aren't that many illegal sellers selling significantly below the lowest end that you see at dispensaries. So I think that that's, it's funny. It's a positive thing if you look at it from the perspective of the overall industry that we're moving slowly toward more legal share. But there's a huge amount of individual damage done by businesses every time you have a falling price. There's another business that had not planned on falling prices or planned on prices falling this far or this fast. And so a lot of people's business models just don't work anymore. And so you do one result of this is actually things like consolidation or bigger businesses that are able to produce at the very lowest costs, surviving at the cost of the smaller operators who are not as efficient in terms of scale.
Are there policy changes that might help? Do you think, what policy changes could help licensed businesses become more price competitive without compromising, regulatory goals and, taxes and their requirements?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you could go through the list of all of the Prop 64 requirements and ask which ones are really essential for public health or safety, which ones are actually protecting consumers in an important way or in a measurable way. And like, for example, I think many people would agree that uh, that testing that a regime of testing for pesticides or contaminants that could be harmful, that's something that they do feel is value. It's at least it's value added. It's something that some consumers are willing to pay extra for the legal weed because it's safe and it's tested. But then you look at something like track and trace, the metric system that the state spends 20 or $30 million a year on. That's by law, but under Prop 64, they have to do this. So it's not the regulator's fault. It was written into the bill, but by spending this much money that's money that is being collected in taxes and ultimately borne by consumers and by the businesses. So it's not clear it's not clear that the track and trace system, and this is not just California, across the country, I look around and it's not clear that these track and trace systems are adding any value to the states. They're not being, effectively or frequently used by law enforcement or by tax collection agencies or by anyone else. Whatever purpose they were meant to serve, presumably some safety function or tax collection function of keeping or tracing product that leaks into the illegal market. It's not really being used that way. It's just a cost that doesn't have any particular benefit. It's nice for people like us who research cannabis, and we have this like incredibly detailed amazing data that we're very lucky to be able to work with, from DCC and from I've also been working with Nevada state data this year and doing some research reports with UNLV there. But it's really cool to be able to look at transaction by transaction what's happened, for years. It's a big, huge data set. It's a lot of work. My colleague Olina, who was on this conversation last month, she spent so much of her life for 2 years parsing and understanding and analyzing these metric data, and we had other people working too. So it was a big task. So it was great for us. We learned a lot from it, but I can't say that that translates to it's not as important as having a viable legal market. Our research is not as important as having the product be affordable and competitive with illegal product. And so it's not clear to me. Track and trace would be like one of the high ones on my list of costs that don't have some corresponding big obvious benefit.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was great. I had a question down the line of what did you think of track and trace? So I'm glad we got that covered. Yeah, it sounds like it just is something. So you're saying in other markets as well. I'm not really too well versed with what's going on in the rest of the country, but other forms of track and trace, similar problems in other states, other markets.
Yeah, there are two or three big companies that provide track and trace software that, in every state with a legal recreational market pretty much has adopted one of them, some form of track and trace, and partly because the early adopters did it and California did it, and now, everyone copies what happens in California or Washington or Colorado. So, but there when it first and this is a large issue. Like, there are many kind of sets of regulations around the uh, country that are sort of eerily familiar. It's a very common practice that whoever does it first and the other states kind of copy and often this is done without any view to whether it's worked well or not. It's just, oh, they did it first, so we can't be criticized for doing what California did or what Colorado did, even if they've even if there's a lot to be desired in terms of the outcomes, especially in the first few years.
You mentioned earlier a bit about like legacy growers and getting them into the legal market and kind of this inevitability of consolidation. Um, but do you see a viable path forward for those that are still considered like legacy growers from the old days, as far as transitioning into the legal market, or is consolidation just an inevitability?
Well, I'd I might say yes to both of those, although that might sound funny. Uh, on the first point, sure, there's plenty of ways into the legal market. There's plenty of ways to be, we're not like doomsday theorists here. There's plenty of ways to be successful. It's a tough business. It's very competitive. Part of what's tough about it is there are just too many companies. There are too many competitors. Probably we have more in terms of, especially in the growing and manufacturing side, especially in the manufacturing side. But I think there's heavy, stiff competition because there was this green rush mentality. A lot of people got into it early and invested a lot of money, and once they have this skin in the game, then they can't just they can't easily just get out of it, so they just keep plugging away, and that's part of what's driving prices down so much. But what I think that the big, what's the big optimistic thing on the horizon for people from the legacy market who are still looking to get in the future or now is just looking ahead to federal legalization. And I don't mean to say that that's going to be a blanket benefit to everyone. One of those things we say in the book and tell people all the time is federal legalization is not going to help the cannabis industry as a whole. It's going to help some businesses and it's going to hurt other businesses. It may help grow the size of the total industry, but it's not. But there's going to be a lot of winners and losers in that game. And some of the people who are going to be losers are going to be the producers, the cultivators in st states that are very expensive to be legal in. Um, and so now that California is kind of getting so cheap, it's not at the top of that list. Places like Massachusetts and New York, where wholesale prices are still in the thousands of dollars, um, and they're not they have much smaller uh, they uh, if they price if their price were cut in two-thirds, they still wouldn't be in wholesale. They'd have to cut their prices, wholesale prices by two-thirds to be competitive on the West Coast. Well, once you have federal legalization, you have interstate commerce. You might have interstate commerce 6 months from now. Who knows? We might have it as soon as it's descheduled and under RFK. Who knows? In the Trump administration, who knows how soon that's coming? No one knew how soon it would come up under Trump or under Harris. But there's no protection suddenly for anyone who's growing in states where it's expensive, where costs are high, and the big input costs, labor, electricity, water, things like that. Places where it's expensive to run businesses and those costs are high are going to have a very hard time competing with cannabis that's coming in from other states. So why am I not a doomsday a theorist here? Because California has the best weed in the world. So California is actually in a uniquely good situation here because when you go to, and I'm not just talking here about uh, federal legalization or interstate commerce, I'm talking about international trade that's also on the horizon at some point. There's, as it is in every agricultural industry, as this industry becomes normalized. So there are going to be huge opportunities to export California weed to all over the country, places where it's extremely uh, valued, which is pretty much everywhere. If you go to Paris or London, people are paying twice as much on the street for California weed, or at least weed that's supposedly from California. Versus the ordinary weed that they're getting locally, so or from other places. And so I think the secret for California really is to, and this goes for small producers or large producers, is to uh, really build a brand that's uh, emphasizing provenance, that's emphasizing where you're from. I think that there will be California brands that are very successful in that market at premium prices. California is not a particularly cheap place to do business or to grow wheat in terms of input costs, but it is a very advantageous in terms of know-how. Yeah, as is with wine, as one commenter just said, and its reputation and these reputation in fact effects, I think, could be very powerful. it's a small, the premium segment is still maybe only 5% of the whole weed market. It's not the majority of consumption in the United States or worldwide, but it's like craft beer,
Mhm.
but that's fine. 5 or 10% of the global market, if you look at it in the international context, is still a lot of people, and a lot of money. And so I think small growers would be who want to kind of dive in this interstate market or international market would be really well advised to like build these kind of really craft kind of brands that are very focused on where they're from, their storylines, the kind of things that appeal to these premium craft type consumers. But that's going to be competitive too, of course. Not lots of craft breweries and lots of small artisanal winemakers don't make it. It's still a tough business.
Um, yeah, for sure. What about operators who are operating in multi-state operators? What about MSOs? And um, as we get towards what you're talking about, like maybe some regulatory shifts or rescheduling. But right now, what we're seeing is, farms shutting down and MSOs having a hard time. What's going on there, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, MSOs having a hard time is I just say it's just a reflection of cannabis having a hard time, adjusting to the market conditions and it's very competitive, like I said. The ones that have been, I mean, one of the issues about MSO is that even though they're operating in many states, they're still under this gated framework where every state is its own has a legal barrier around it. So, you have a company that's operating in 20 states, but they still have to produce their New York weed in New York, and it's really hard and expensive to grow good weed in New York because of the climate and so forth. And so MSOs and larger companies that are operating nationally are going to have a bigger advantage once they're able to produce uh, like wheat or soybean producers, when they're able to produce almost all large amounts of their quantity and concentrate in the places where it's cheapest and easiest to grow. Um, so in the meantime, they're kind of doing the equivalent of operating, 20 little businesses in 20 different states at the same time, and each of the states is at a different regulatory phase and has different local factors affecting their businesses, and so it's a very hard business to be in, I think, and the idea that it's scalable across all these states, I think that the economies of scale they're getting from their size are much more limited than you'd have from most businesses where you're able to have much more centralized production and distribution, warehousing and stuff. But you will see consolidation. That was the second part of your earlier question. You will see consolidation just like you do in every industry. This is just a law of nature. I mean, once you have a legal free trade in any commodity or any good, you have the kind of natural optimal number of, let's say, not even optimal, I would just say the market evolves toward having some number of competitors. It's not like usually 10,000 or something in any industry. You don't have 10, you may have 10,000 breweries, but 90% of the beer is produced by a few dozen. And, um, so you'll see it just as you do in every industry. How much consolidation we'll see is an open question in terms of brands. I think one thing that is interesting about cannabis is that people have shown in our research, we do hedonic regressions of where we look at product characteristics and try to see how much consumers are willing to pay for each of these different characteristics, like THC percentage or strain name, um, indica versus sativa, genetics or brand name. And one thing we've seen so far is that consumers are really not very brand loyal in this industry. They don't seem to be, it's not like people go back to the store every week and ask for Kiva. It doesn't seem like people are willing to pay much for brand names. And so one of these sort of nightmare scenarios where weed turns into just McDonald's or something, it's like there's just one Philip Morris type company that dominates everything, and there's one brand and all the weeds commoditized. That's just not what consumers want. Weed consumers, I think, like wine consumers in many ways, they like to try new things. They have a taste for novelty and for diversity, and they like to try new strains, and so certainly there'll be brand loyalty. I think that you'll see evolving in the direction kind of wine where you have things like clubs and members and people who visit farms. It's kind of tourism and hospitality that's been talked about a lot this week MJ BizCon in Las Vegas. Everyone's talking about how that could work. There's a lot of barriers to it right now. For example, you can't mix kind of weed sales and other types of sales, alcohol and restaurant businesses and so forth. But as that's changing, there's going to be opportunities there to get some customer loyalty through these direct consumer relationships. I also think that you could see in the future legislation to help small cannabis producers or farms develop these kinds of tourism and hospitality angles to their business where they're able to sell direct to consumers, just as craft breweries and wineries enjoy certain exemptions from the ordinary laws if they host people on their property and sell directly to them. So you could see that model working um, for some types of businesses. But given this larger issue of not much brand loyalty, also not much loyalty to strains, there's just thousands. I think you're gonna have consumers over time falling back on two things: provenance, where does it come from? What's the story behind it? Which is again kind of similar to wine.
I had a couple more questions. I know I think we're doing okay on time, but I had like two more, kind of an industry related question about equity,
Yep.
um, and then maybe a future forward thinking question. So, um, as you know, Prop 64 had this social equity component kind of built into the actual law. Um, how do you think California has done, lived up to the social equity, and environmental protections as well? But let's just talk social equity for the time that we have. The governor's office of business development, right? GoBiz is the one that handles the equity grant jurisdictions in California. Do you think that's a good fit? How do you see the whole equity system working? Especially just real quick, you were talking with regards to like what consumers are looking for, and the notion that equity products are maybe going to um, afford producers like the ability to charge a bit more for their products. You see all of this, yeah, just weigh in on equity grants and the equity program here in California.
Yeah, so this is something that's I think very similar. You've had a similar phenomena around the country actually with um, other states. A lot of states have tried different social equity programs. I mean, I think first of all, they're all coming from the right place in people's hearts. They're well-intentioned programs. Um, Everyone looks at the dark history of the war on drugs and it's like the whole point of legalization. What people like me and my friends were like activists for this stuff in high school, and when it was all about freeing people from prison. That was always it was about these families that have been destroyed, by the drug war for so many years, like just freeing those people. And I think that's also why, Prop 64 and some other initiatives around the country were passed with so many compromises and so many difficulties of implementation, is because you had to make so many compromises just to get it through, and it was kind of by any means necessary. Get people out of prison first and then deal with the rest. So now we're dealing with the rest. And the social equity kind of the approaches to sort of writing, you you know, uh, righting those wrongs, not just ending the wrongs, but righting the wrongs of the past, um, were took a lot of different forms. I mean, I think that the ones that have been most successful have been around the country have been closest to just give people some cash and help. They just don't have enough money. Lend people money or give people money. I think a lot of the initiatives that have been focused around you get to be first in line for a license, those have been the least successful. Like New York, New York tried this initiative where only people and their families, people who had a drug conviction or marijuana conviction in their of themselves or in their immediate family were eligible to apply for dispensary license in the first round. Sounds like, the most kind of extreme thing you could do to benefit, the people who were wronged in the war on drugs. And yet, if you practically speaking, it didn't work because there weren't enough. It's very difficult for people with criminal records to be in a position to be able to have, the resources or the money or the connections to build a successful business in a very tough and competitive industry. And so just giving them the first licenses, uh, it sounds so great, but it's like, come on in, the water's fine. And then these people, a lot of them ended up losing their life savings because and then with all the levels of local approval, um, they failed to ever get off the ground and just lost their money. And the state's now in this position of having to maybe compensate them. No one knows what's going to happen to a lot of these people. I think a lot of them have rightful legal claims against the state for what happened. They were promised certain real estate properties that didn't pan out, things like that. I know you asked about California. I mean, California is not as extreme example. They've tried different things, and I know there's ongoing discussions about what more could be done. But I think the things that are most the things that would be most effective is just would be like lending access to capital, but also I think regulatory pe people to help deal with the regulatory obstacles and filling out forms. It's like the sleeping giant. Um, I'm really bad at filling out my tax forms. I know a lot of people who hate and are bad at filling out forms, but you put yourself in the shoes of someone who didn't have the privilege and education that I had, and like, how difficult it is to just deal with the many layers of bureaucracy and all the little things you can screw up on an application form for anything. And so I think like people that help I've seen some initiatives where there's direct help for social equity applicants who are uh, where they're providing someone who can really fill out the forms for you and help you fix the problems and deal with the correspondence with the regulatory agencies. I think that's extremely valuable because that's something that, the successful applicants often have ended up spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on Ivy League type consultants in order to deal with that stuff. And obviously, that's something that most people don't have access to. Um, but I don't know. Do you have any other kind of, angle that you wanted me to talk about the
No,
social
I
equity?
mean, I'm particularly interested in the in California's equity grants for local jurisdictions program. The
Yeah.
governor, that's. But I think your answer was fantastic to sort of do an overview. And yeah, I've just sort of seen that as well in conversations with people that have sort of managed to get into the equity space, and it's proven to be too onerous. And perhaps just like a normal business loan might have been a much better option, but that's not available. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's an interesting space.
And make it a viable business. That's the other point. I mean, like when, you know, ultimately, if you want to do right by the people who you're bringing out of the war on drugs and you want to bring them out of poverty and right the wrongs of the past, then you have to provide them with a business model. I mean, not provide them with a model, but provide them with a structure for a business model that actually works. So if the business model works, if people can make money in cannabis, in legal cannabis, then social equity operators can make money and other people can make money. If no one can make money, then any initiative trying to bring social equity people into the game is not going to work if no one's making money, if everyone's going to lose money. So ultimately, the regulatory and I think it's really important to remember that the regulatory costs, the more like barriers and regulatory costs and taxes you add, the more that disproportionately benefits large companies at the expense of small companies. So the the large companies, the MSOs, the chains, the multinationals, they have all the resources in the world to hire the fanciest lawyers and consultants to help them get through this process, lobbying and so forth. They also have economies of scale that enable them to compete with illegal at the lower end. And so the more you level the best way to level the playing field, at least, to not have uh, socially disadvantaged folks like literally just competing on unfair grounds is to minimize the amount of extra costs and regulations you add to cannabis specifically compared to all other businesses, while of course still ensuring public safety um, and health and environmental concerns as we do with every industry.
This will be my last question, and we'll jump to questions, and it's a broad one. And you touched on some of this earlier about the uncertainty of rescheduling and really what the future might bring. But given the current market conditions and the regulatory frameworks that we have in California, what are your key predictions for the next 3 to 5 years for the cannabis industry?
Well, I'm going to assume for the sake of argument that federal decriminalization or descheduling happens within that period. So, um, it looks like all signs point to that happening. If so, there's two paths we can go with. I mean, that's the big, the two big elephants in the room about the next 3 to 5 years is number one, what happens with federal decriminalization or descheduling or legalization and regulation, and the second one is what happens with the Farm Bill next year with the definition of hemp. So on the on the on the federal legalization point, the thing that would be give the rosiest outlook for the industry in California, legal industry in California and around the country would be mere descheduling. So just uh, taking marijuana off the list of controlled substance out of the Controlled Substances Act, out of the list of prohibited um, things, and basically that just hands it to the states, and it doesn't add a another layer of federal of federal, oversight, bureaucracy, licensing, testing, anything else, taxation. It essentially says it leaves it to the states to regulate it, and it legalizes essentially interstate commerce. So, like I said before, that'll bring some winners and losers. Interstate commerce will result in a lot of competition. It'll mean that states where it's cheap to produce, they'll have a boom in on the cultivation side. Life will get a lot easier for a lot of cannabis businesses like IRS 280E. This tax deduction issues will go away, and of course fear and risk of federal enforcement at any point will go away. But the I don't see that as being uh, a sort of major turning point for the industry. I think it's incremental. I mean, for the most part, aside from 280E, it's interstate commerce that'll be the biggest effect of that. It won't be. It's not just the relaxing of the laws, because in most states where most cannabis is transacted in America, it's already essentially federally legal in the sense of no one's getting, the feds are not going around busting people the way they used to. And cops certainly aren't locally. On the hemp side, that's a big open question about whether the federal government, and this is just like a fierce debate right now. Everyone's talking about it at MJ BizCon. What are they going to do? Are they going to rein in this definition of hemp, of hemp that was in the 2018 Farm Bill? For those of you who aren't clear on what this issue is, basically in the 2018 Farm Bill, the United States government came up with a definition of it. It more precisely defined marijuana as THC as cannabis with THC above 0.3%, and hemp was whatever's below 0.3%. Actually, that definition came from an earlier Farm Bill, but what happened in 2018 was that the hemp was legalized in the sense that you could legally buy and sell cannabis that was under 0.3% THC. The problem is the way they wrote it was Delta 9 THC. For technical reasons, some people starting in the southeastern United States claimed that this was a loophole because they said Delta 9 THC, which doesn't technically convert to Delta. It's actually Delta 9 THCA that's the precursor to THC in cannabis flower that doesn't convert until it's smoked. So their claim is that it doesn't become weed until it doesn't become illegal until it's uh, combusted. That's on the THCA side, and then there's all these other ways that kind of loopholes have been claimed uh, uh, for things like distilling large amounts of hemp, legal hemp, into extract and then spraying it back on or adding it to products to obtain basically normal THC level, Delta 9 THC products, and claiming that they're legal hemp. I don't have a legal opinion on this, and I don't know the politics or lobbying side of it, but I will say that it's just a big how the federal government chooses to handle this, whether it's a clarification whether it's a narrowing definition that basically goes back to this idea that hemp under the federal framework is just a um, industrial product, which was, I think, the original intent of the bill at the time. That's what got it through politically. They're like, this is just industrial hemp, and then it was CBD, and then we went through this progression now where it's, being used as a pretext for selling what's essentially the same. They'll have the same products that are being sold in the legal cannabis systems, and so the legal cannabis operators are understandably not happy that they have this competition that don't have to go through the licensing process and regulations and expensive regulations that they do. So you have this kind of internal, I don't want to say civil war, but there's a big conflict within the cannabis world now of the people who are say, let's just regulate cannabis like hemp, and others say, well, no, hemp needs to be regulated like cannabis. And the distinction of the two, which is going to be what's clarified probably in the next farm bill, will have a big impact on what happens next in that 3 to 5 year period. But what's interesting right now is the way that the southeastern states like Tennessee and Kentucky and Texas, Florida have kind of leapfrogged, and you're seeing, for example, a very big beverage market evolving there
Mhm.
that's being, hotly debated and discussed, and is certainly becoming more and more of an economic factor with companies like Anheuser-Busch distributing now THC beverages in Texas and Florida, and Total Wine. carrying them and so forth. It's very interesting, rapidly developing situation.
Indeed. And then the Farm Bill it's 5 years, right? Is it every 5 years that they rewrite the Farm Bill? And right now we're a year late. They were supposed to do it last year, so they're already a bit late on getting that. Yeah, so uncertainty continues to be a factor in the cannabis business. Go
Yeah,
figure. I wanted to jump to our questions because we're running out of time. We could keep talking all day. This is great. But let's just jump into questions before we run out of time. This is from Tim Moreland. Tim says, Dr. Goldstein, are you aware that AB 195, which eliminated the cultivation tax, has a provision which could trigger an increase in the excise tax up to 19% if tax revenue falls below what would have been collected from the cultivation tax? Question mark. This increase has been triggered and is set to be effective in the summer of 2025. How do you think the excise tax increase will impact the legal market?
it's not good. I mean, in a situation we're in now where there's still, probably the majority of shares is illegal, adding to the excise tax that, as I mentioned before, is already, quite high, especially when you compound it with local taxes and sales tax and everything. You're just putting a bigger and bigger wedge between the consumers and the producers, what they receive. And so, um, you know, it's certainly if you want the legal share to increase, it's going in the wrong direction. I mean, but I can't speak to, from the state perspective, they need to collect the taxes they need to collect, and the license fees, for example, they need to collect those because that goes to funding the agency under the way that the bill was written. So, um, yeah, I don't have anything more profound to say than that, any increase is not going to help. It's going to hurt.
Okay. This next one's from Michael Jenkins, who asks, in what context are you using the term win? Or what does winning mean, I guess?
Yeah, we actually wrote the book title to kind of beg that question. We wanted you to ask that. So, um, it's and that's the reason is because it's not obvious what it means. It could mean, from the state perspective, it could mean tax collections. It could mean a viable legal industry. It could mean less crime and so forth. But I think in the book we kind of just set up a bunch of different types of impacts that legalization has and say, well, depending on what your priorities are, here's what policies and here's what the economics are of each of those. If for example your number one priority you just wanted to get 100% as close to 100% as possible in the legal market and almost none in the illegal market, then one thing you could do would just be to subsidize it to such an extent that the legal price just goes below the illegal price. I mean, then that's what they're doing I mean, almost in Switzerland. There's a proposal in Switzerland where the government just says, okay, the cost of producing legal is $10 a gram. The cost of the illegal in the street is $6 a gram. So, or francs, or uh, so you, and so if the government wants to just pay that 4 franc difference, great. Okay. I mean, if the government wants to spend its money on that, then it can achieve the goal of having legal weed be almost all the market if it's if and if it combines subsidizing it to the point that it brings the price lower or the same and also access. And if the stores are everywhere and there are no restrictions um, on hours of operation and things like that. I mean, one of the big things about the turf that illegal has is often determined, it's partly by geography, but also partly by hours of operation. Um, and so like on Friday and Saturday nights after 10 p.m. in California, the legal market has 100% share because it's illegal for any legal store to be open. And so, or to do delivery, and that's like prime time for going out and partying in LA, and all those people can only buy legal weed. Um, so, what does it mean to win? I mean, of course, to win, I would personally, I think that winning means less people being thrown in prison for cannabis than previously, and and it's funny because with some of the directions it's gone, you've seen the possibility of actually more cannabis crimes being committed or maybe even enforced against than previously. When you suddenly make all these, um, when you go from a medical system that's pretty open where kind of no one's really going to get in trouble for growing and selling it, as long as they're taking people's state IDs and uh, checking ID and doctor's letter, to a system where if you don't comply with every single stage of the process, then you risk breaking the law. And so to me, winning means not just going from mostly legal, going from an illegal system to a mostly as legal as possible system, but also doing that without having too much additional criminal enforcement necessary. Like it's not, and people always think shutting down the illegal businesses is that's going to be the key to helping the legal weed win. That's not true. We don't see evidence for that anywhere. You can go around shutting down as many illegal um, businesses as you want, and it'll have a little deterrent effect because people are a little scared when they see it, but it doesn't change market prices. The issue is market prices. There's always going to be a flow of unlicensed weed, and competing on price is the only long-term solution there. So sort of the solution, practically speaking, in the long run is it's about price. Can legal weed win by being competitive on price? It's already competitive on quality. How can it be competitive on price? Then you'll have a thriving market with that's more like what we all imagined when we, I think, fought for legalization back in the day. I think you're muted.
Thank you so much. Yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah.
From Maggie Phillipsborn, it's a good segue to her question. Scaling agriculture for market cost efficiencies is a race to the bottom. What examples of this have ever existed in U.S. agricultural product production that is positive for the environment and consumers?
Scaling, did you say scaling agricultural?
Scaling agriculture for market cost efficiencies is a race to the bottom, is the first sentence.
I mean, it's a race to the bottom on price, but you know, you can have uh, you can have t tomatoes or lettuce that are produced by large agricultural enterprises that cost a dollar a pound in the supermarket, and you can have $5 or $10 a pound products that you get at your local farmers market, and that are small, that are coming from small local farms, and those are both part of the market. And rich people have the luxury of being able to afford $5 or $10 a pound for their tomatoes, and poor people have to make a decision between whether they want to spend on um, uh, save money by buying mass-produced, more industrially produced tomatoes and able to afford a bike for their kid for Christmas. So, you know, it's about, if you want to talk about social equity, for me, the availability of the very cheapest produced products is more benefit to the poor than the rich. We have the luxury of choosing which one we want if we can afford to shop at farmers markets.
Mhm.
And it's the same thing with cannabis. Uh, if you have, if the legal cannabis industry is not able to produce very inexpensive weed at the bottom end of the price spectrum, then that part will just remain illegal. Um, and then the poor people who can't afford the more expensive stuff, um, instead of getting something from a more mass-produced farm, it's not going to be artisanal, it's not going to be craft, but instead of getting that, the alternative uh, is that they just keep buying it illegally, and it doesn't have these safety protections, and then you have a class division about who's getting protected by things like pesticide regulations.
Um, I had a question, but I can do it later and we can chat maybe offline because I think we're wrapping up. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us and for answering these questions from the audience. And yeah, it's been really informative. I appreciate your time. Um, yeah, maybe I'll follow up with you on email. I had a couple more things I wanted to chat about, but it's been a great conversation. Thanks.
Yeah, happy to. And also, any of you here are welcome to email me as well with questions if you didn't have time to get to some people's questions, or if anything else. I'm always happy to chat with you folks.
Thank you so much.
All right, thanks, Seth.
Uh,
Thanks.
yeah,
Um,
before we close out, just a few words. So next semester we'll be continuing this conversation series for folks. And I think first up, we have a speaker from Santa Barbara on January 17th, and then we'll be hearing from a speaker from Cal Poly Humboldt as well in early February. We're aiming to have these talks every 2 weeks, roughly, every second Friday, though there's a little bit of variation. And you can always, though, follow us. On the left-hand side is QR code for our monthly newsletter. And on the right-hand side is a link tree to all of our upcoming events and websites, social media, etc. And so what we'll do is we'll actually leave up this screen for a few minutes so people can use these QR codes as they desire. And yeah, you're always welcome to reach out to Seth, to Robin, to myself, to anybody here. I hope it was informative and hope you can make it back. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks again.